An atheist journalist thought she had the perfect argument until the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, responded with a story that changed everything. Before we continue the story, tell us in the comment below, where are you watching from? And if you like these kinds of stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow at 7 p.m. we have an amazing fresh story lined up for you. The stage was set. The bright studio lights illuminated the sleek set of Global Perspectives, a primetime debate show known for its intense political and cultural discussions. At the center of it all stood Bukele, the charismatic Salvadoran leader with a calm demeanor and a firm stance. Across from him sat Alan Brooks, a veteran journalist renowned for her no-holds-barred questions and unfiltered style. Millions of people were watching. The tension was tangible not just in the studio, but across Latin America. Although the debate had been billed as a discussion of leadership and public policies, everyone knew it was going to delve much deeper. Bukele had earned a reputation for sticking to his principles and never shying away from tough conversations. Alan, on the other hand, was famous for cornering her guests, exposing what she considered flaws in their arguments. The first 20 minutes followed a standard political format: economics, government regulations, and social issues. Bukele handled the rapid-fire questions with confidence, speaking with clarity and precision. He wasn't just a politician, he was a natural communicator who knew how to connect with audiences both in the studio and beyond. Then Alan leaned forward slightly in her chair, narrowing her eyes. It was a subtle gesture, but any seasoned speaker would have recognized it. She was preparing to steer the conversation in a more personal direction. The energy in the room shifted. Producers, cameramen, even the audience sensed that the debate was about to take an unexpected turn. "President Bukele," Alan began, his voice controlled. "You often speak of your faith as a guiding principle in your leadership. You've even mentioned that faith plays a role in public policy decisions." Bukele nodded slightly, waiting for the real question. "But let's be honest," Alan continued, leaning in. "Religion, especially Christianity, is on the decline. Fewer and fewer people believe in a higher power. Science has provided answers that religion never could. Yet, you continue to defend faith as if it's a universal truth. Why?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Bukele didn't react immediately. He let the question hang in the air, absorbing its weight. Alan wasn't just questioning her personal beliefs. She was challenging the relevance of faith in today's world. The journalist pressed on. "I ask because millions consider faith to be nothing more than an outdated crutch, something that hinders progress rather than propels it forward. Do you think that's fair, or do you simply refuse to accept that faith is losing its place in contemporary society?" The atmosphere grew tense. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every expression, every reaction. Alan had thrown a spark onto dry grass, and everyone waited to see if Bukele would let it ignite, or if he would respond in an unexpected way. But the president didn't rush to answer. He took a deep breath, tilted his head slightly, and allowed a faint smile to form. He knew exactly what to say. Alan sat back, tapping his pen gently on the table. She waited. The audience waited. The silence wasn't awkward, it was electric. Finally, Bukele spoke, his voice calm and steady. "You say faith is an outdated crutch that hinders progress," he began. "But let me ask you something." Alan paused briefly, then tilted her head slightly. "Where do people turn when science has no answer?" Alan pursed her lips but didn't interrupt. Bukele continued, "You see, it's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable. It's easy to dismiss faith when everything is going well. When your job is secure, your family is healthy, and the world makes sense." He paused, locking eyes with Alan. "But when the ground falls out from under you, when your child is dying in a hospital bed, when you're standing in front of a coffin, when doctors tell you there's nothing more they can do." The studio fell silent. Even the producers, who usually whispered among themselves behind the cameras, seemed frozen. Alan adjusted her jacket, not breaking eye contact with Bukele. "People turn to faith out of desperation," Alan said neutrally. "That doesn't make it real, it just makes it comforting." Bukele nodded slightly, as if he'd anticipated that response. "Comfort isn't a weakness, Alan. It's part of being human. And faith is more than just comfort. It's resilience. It's hope. It's the belief that, even in the darkest moments, there is still a purpose. She leaned forward slightly. You can call it naive if you like, but I'll tell you this. It's the only thing that's kept people from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years. Alan exhaled through her nose, shifting her position slightly in her seat. So, you're saying faith is necessary for survival? Bukele shook his head. No, faith is what makes survival meaningful. Alan smiled faintly, shaking her head. You're good, President Bukele, but let's talk about them. He gestured slightly as if restarting the conversation. Religious institutions have been responsible for some of history's worst atrocities: wars, oppression, corruption, and yet you defend faith as if it's only ever been a force for good. Bukele didn't flinch. I'm not going to deny that atrocities have been committed in the name of religion. But let's be fair, Alan. Faith has also been the driving force behind some of humanity's greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness. The end of slavery, civil rights movements, countless hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations, all were started by people who believed their faith called them to help others. You can't erase that just because some have twisted faith to suit their own agendas. Alan was silent, studying him. She didn't have an immediate response, and Bukele noticed. He seized the moment. But if you really want to know why I believe in faith, why I defend it, his tone dropped slightly. It's not because of history. It's not because of politics. He paused briefly. It's because of one person I met years ago. Alan's brow furrowed slightly. One person? Bukele nodded, his voice softening. Her name was Maria, and she taught me something about faith that no debate could ever erase. The audience held their breath. No one, neither Alan nor the viewers, was prepared for the story that was about to unfold. Bukele lightly intertwined his fingers on the table, never breaking eye contact with Alan. Years ago, when I was a young entrepreneur just starting out in politics, I had the chance to meet Maria at a community event. It was a program supporting senior citizens, one of those events where politicians usually show up just for a photo op. He paused for a moment, his voice lowering slightly. But I wasn't there for that. I was just doing my job. I was supposed to take notes, listen politely, and leave. He exhaled slowly. But Maria stopped me in my tracks. She had a special presence, not because she was loud or imposing, quite the opposite. She spoke softly, calmly, but when she spoke, people listened. There was something about her, a quiet strength that only comes from surviving things that should have destroyed you. Alan kept a neutral expression, but she wasn't looking at her notes anymore. She was listening. She told me she had buried 2 sons. Bukele continued, his voice steady. One died of cancer, the other because of a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. She had no siblings or close family. He paused briefly, letting those words sink in. And yet she stood there in front of me, smiling, sipping tea, and asking how my life was going. She told me something I'll never forget. The president swallowed before continuing. She said, "Faith isn't about proof. It's about what keeps you standing when there's no proof." The studio was utterly silent. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade away. She told me that every morning she woke up and thanked God, not because her life had been easy, not because she had been spared suffering, but because she was still here. Bukele exhaled slowly. I was 22 when I met her. I thought I understood what strength was. But Maria showed me what it truly means. He leaned in slightly. And in that moment, I realized something. Faith isn't something people cling to out of desperation. It's what keeps them from collapsing. The words hung in the air. Alan blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if to respond, but then she closed it again. She couldn't find the words. The weight of Bukele's story was felt throughout the studio. Even the host, usually eager to keep the show moving, stayed silent. Bukele didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it linger. Finally, Alan cleared her throat, shifting slightly in her seat. That's a powerful story, she admitted, her voice lower than before. But don't you think it's just that? A story? Maria found something that worked for her. That doesn't mean faith is a universal truth. Bukele nodded slightly, as if he had anticipated that response. You're right about that, Alan, he said. Faith isn't about proving something to others. It's about what people have lived through. He paused briefly before continuing. And if you really listen, if you truly pay attention, you'll hear that story told millions of times in different ways. Alan exhaled heavily, rubbing the bridge of her nose. You see, Mr. President, that's my issue with faith. It can't be measured. It's based on emotions, on experiences. It can't be quantified. And yet, people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone. Bukele tilted his head slightly. You mean something like hope? Alan blinked. Hope? Yes, hope. Hope can't be measured either. It's not scientific. You can't prove it exists in any tangible way. He let those words settle before continuing. And yet, people have fought wars for it, survived the impossible for it. They hold on to it even when logic tells them they shouldn't. Alan shifted in her seat but didn't interrupt. Bukele's gaze was steady. Tell me, Alan, if someone loses their home in an earthquake, would you tell them their hope is just a simple emotional crutch? That their belief in a better future isn't real just because you can't put it under a microscope? The journalist didn't respond. Bukele's stare didn't waver. That's the point with faith. Faith isn't about controlling people. It's not about forcing beliefs on anyone. Bukele said, his voice calm yet unyielding. It's about how people find meaning in their lives. Alan watched him silently. You can call it irrational, Alan, Bukele continued. But when someone loses everything and still gets up the next day, when they keep moving forward, when they find strength where there shouldn't be any, there's something in that. Something you can't measure, but also something you can't ignore. Alan tapped her fingers lightly on the table. Her usual sharp, confrontational posture seemed to have softened. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was thinking. Noticing the shift in tone, the host decided to step in. Alan, do you have a response to that? Alan opened her mouth as if to reply, but closed it again. She glanced at the audience, perhaps looking for a cue, a reason to anchor herself in the conversation. But no one spoke. No one moved. Finally, her voice lacked the usual sharpness. I think I need to process this. A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the fierce counterattack many had expected. It wasn't a crushing rebuttal or a clear victory. It was something much rarer, a moment of honesty. But the real reaction, the one that would reverberate throughout the country, was yet to come. The debate ended a few minutes later, but the conversation was far from over. The final applause sounded hesitant, as though the audience was still trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Nobody rose from their seats in a hurry. This wasn't just another political exchange. They had felt something, and that wasn't easy to dismiss. Alan glanced at Bukele, gave a slight nod, and removed her microphone. Without another word, she left the studio. She didn't stick around for post-debate analysis or small talk. She walked straight out, shoulders stiff, lost in thought. Bukele, on the other hand, stayed in his seat for a moment longer. He could hear the whispers of the technical crew, see how the audience exchanged glances. Some looked moved, others looked uncomfortable, but nobody was indifferent. Then the cameras turned off and the first wave hit. Bukele's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Missed calls, messages, notifications piling up. Social media had exploded. Clips from the debate were spreading at lightning speed. Every word was dissected. Every expression was analyzed. But what surprised Bukele most wasn't the reaction from his usual supporters. It was the response from people who had never supported him before. I'm not religious, one comment read, but what he said made me think. Another said, I've never heard anyone defend faith without attacking those who don't believe. That was different. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about something bigger. Post after post, comment after comment, people weren't arguing as usual. Sure, there were critics, expected pushback from those who dismissed the topic outright, but something else was happening. Something Bukele hadn't seen in a long time. People weren't just reacting, they were listening. His team sprang into action, coordinating responses to the media. The headlines were quick to follow. Nayib Bukele leaves atheist journalists speechless. A debate shaking Latin America. Has Bukele just changed the conversation on faith and politics? Even late-night analysis shows that rarely gave Bukele serious coverage. often ridiculing him, were discussing the debate with a newfound seriousness. But the most surprising reaction came from Alan. That night, he said nothing. No tweets, no interviews, no follow-up comments. The journalist, who was always the first to control the narrative, was silent. Until the next morning. At 8:37 a.m., he finally broke his silence with a single message. I've been in journalism for more than 30 years. Last night was the first time I walked away from an interview realizing I had more questions than answers. That was all. No grand declarations, no damage control, just honesty. And that was enough to trigger another wave of reactions. But the true impact of that debate wouldn't become clear until days later. What started as a standard political discussion had evolved into something far deeper. This wasn't just about Bukele or Allen anymore. It was about something people had avoided acknowledging for years. People were looking for something more. Social media was saturated with the topic. You couldn't scroll through the internet without seeing the debate dissected from every angle. Podcasters, columnists, and commentators weighed in. Some called it a watershed moment for faith in public discourse. Others saw it as a wake-up call. But the most unexpected reactions came from the most unlikely places. A comedian, known for mocking religion, admitted on his podcast, "Look, I still don't believe in God, but that man made me wish I did, and that says something." A well-known scientist tweeted, "Faith and science don't have to be enemies." Last night reminded me why so many people still hold on to belief, even in the face of uncertainty. Then came the emails. Bukele's inbox was always full. Messages from supporters, critics, policy requests. But now he was getting letters from people who didn't fit any of those categories. One email in particular stood out. It was from a woman named Rebecca. "I haven't stepped foot in a church in 20 years. I lost my faith a long time ago. But after watching your debate, I sat in my car and cried. Not because I suddenly found God or had some dramatic revelation, but because I realized something. I missed believing in something bigger than myself. I didn't even know how much until last night. Thank you for making me think." Bukele read the message twice, then a third time. He had spent his political career fighting for policies, debating laws. But this was different. This wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about getting votes. It couldn't be measured in polls or political victories. It was about a conversation people were too afraid to start. And it wasn't just Rebecca. In the following weeks, more stories poured in. People sharing their own Marias, their grandmothers, their neighbors, a stranger in a hospital waiting room who had whispered words of faith when they needed them most. This wasn't about proving who was right and who was wrong. It wasn't about conversions or ideological wins. It was about remembering that faith, whether in God, humanity, or something still incomprehensible, wasn't a weakness. It was what kept people standing when everything else failed. And that realization is something no debate could ever erase. As the echoes of the debate began to fade, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another political moment. It wasn't something that would be forgotten in a news cycle. It wouldn't be drowned out by the endless noise of social media. It was a reminder that no matter how divided we seem, no matter how loudly the world declares faith obsolete, people are still searching for meaning. People are still looking for something beyond the tangible. That night, Bukele didn't try to change minds. He just told a story. And sometimes, a story is enough. If this story made you think, if it stirred something within you, don't let it end here. Keep asking questions. Keep searching. Keep listening. Because sometimes the answers we seek don't come from winning a debate. They come from conversations we never expected to have. Thank you for watching. If the story warms your heart, subscribe to the channel and click the screen for more inspirational stories of resilience, compassion, and hope.